Greetings and welcome. My name is Kathy Overton. I'm with the Friends of Arlington's David M. Brown Planetarium. And with me today is Dr. Alice Monet, who is also a longtime member, former president of the Friends of Arlington's David M. Brown Planetarium. And we've got a special talk by Dr. Monet today. She's going to talk to us about astronomy in Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. So just a little bit about the Friends before we start. We are a nonprofit group that helps support the Arlington County Public Schools Planetarium, and we also promote public use of the planetarium as well as in the schools and public science education. And this is part of our ongoing effort to provide information even while the planetarium is temporarily closed for construction. And so we are here to provide a variety of talks over the next year until the planetarium reopens. We also hope to add in some in-person events as things calm down a little bit from the pandemic. So stay tuned for more events coming up. Hopefully in November, for November 14th, we're planning a hybrid event in person and online, celebrating the upcoming launch of the James Webb Space Telescope. But for now, we're going to hear about Chaco Canyon. So I'm going to give it over to Dr. Monet.
Thanks, Kathy, and thanks to all of you who are joining us today. Um, I think I should start by introducing myself a little more. I'm an astronomer, now a retired astronomer, and I worked for most of my career for the Naval Observatory. And about 45 years ago, as I recall, I was asked to assist with an archaeoastronomy research project. And that happened to involve Chaco Canyon. An artist named Anna Safar had been exploring Chaco and had found a petroglyph that appeared to have astronomical significance. But she was an artist, not an astronomer, and she was advised to find somebody who could help with the astronomical aspects of this petroglyph, and she came to the Naval Observatory. And at that time, I was a graduate student. I was also the photographic person for scientific publications of the observatory, so I was called in to assist with the graphics for the articles on this research project. And I learned all about the Sundagger, and I learned about Chaco Canyon, and I thought, wow, that is so cool. I really have to go there. And 45 years later, I finally did. If we could start this show, Kathy. So a few weeks ago, I now live in Albuquerque. A few weeks ago, a group that I belonged to in Albuquerque had a camping trip to Chaco Canyon. And the first night we were there, we were all set up in the canyon at the group campground that we were assigned. And I looked around, and right there, within walking distance, was Fajada Butte, which is the location of this Sundagger that I had learned about so many years before. And I was just so excited to actually be there. And we spent the next 4 days exploring the canyon and hearing a number of talks by experts. And actually, I gave a talk about astronomy. And it was wonderful. So I want to share with you some of what I learned about Chaco, and maybe you'll be inspired to go visit someday yourselves. And you don't have to wait for 45 years. Next, please. So this is a list of the questions that I hope to address today. Pretty basic questions. What is Chaco Canyon? And what is the astronomical connection? How is the history of Chaco being explored? And what is known about Chaco and what remains a mystery? And then if we have time at the end, I just want to say a few words about whether Chaco is worth visiting, a purely personal opinion here. And finally, I think I'd like to share to look at the question of whether Chaco is at risk. So if we could move ahead. Chaco is located in the high desert in northwestern New Mexico, very close to the four corners of New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Arizona. It's at an elevation of 6,000 feet. So it's not so much a deep canyon as it is a plateau area surrounded by higher mesas. So it is a canyon, but it is very, very high. The air is thin and dry. It's quite an arid region of New Mexico. Chaco was the center, considered the center of culture and the geographic center of a larger region. And we can see in the next slide the approximate outlines of this region. It was, whoops, back one, please. So this is not an exact outline, but this is the line shows the approximate area encompassed by Chaco's companion pueblos and villages and ceremonial sites and trading partners. And throughout this region, surrounding the four corners, there are ruins and vestiges of the other occupied areas, the other areas where people resided and worked and worshipped and conducted ceremonies and so on. And there's a network of ancient roads that connects Chaco Canyon to these outlying areas. So Chaco was the center, but it certainly was not alone or isolated. And what I didn't show in this diagram is that Chaco's trading extended southwards into Mexico and possibly even as far as Costa Rica. There were items found in the Chaco ruins that were made in very distant locations to the south. So their influence was felt far and wide. Next, please. Chaco is now very arid and barren. And this picture of me was taken in front of the largest ruin, the famous Pueblo Bonito, which you can just barely see in the background. But I've showed this picture mostly to show the geography. The canyon is clearly an ancient riverbed. And you can see in this picture that there's a cliff in the distance, and I'm actually standing on a cliff to the north of Bonito, which is similarly elevated. And it certainly looks to me like an area that was cleared out by water, was eroded by water. And then at this time, there's an arroyo, a very deep arroyo, which you can see in this picture. And there is still water running, surface water running in that arroyo. The cliffs, the rock around Chaco is sandstone, and it was deposited when this entire area was underwater, when it was an ocean or an inland sea. And it was quite interesting to walk around and see all of the fossils, all of the sea creatures embedded in the stone. They're everywhere. They're everywhere. This was, a very populated ocean at one time. Next, please. There are numerous buildings in Chaco, all of them in ruins at this point. Not all of them have been excavated, but this is one. While we were there, our guide, who was a photographer, got us all rousted out of our tents at dawn to go get pictures of some of these ruins when the light was really nice. So this is a picture. You can see by the shadows that there are a bunch of us sleepy people taking photographs of this wonderful ruin by dawn's early light. There are extensive um, dwellings and ceremonial sites and uh, petroglyphs and roads and lots of stuff that indicates that there was at one time a large population, possibly 5,000 people or more. They may not have lived there year round. It's possible, they say now, historians are saying, no, it's possible that just a couple thousand people might have resided in Chaco permanently. But because it was a center of trade, there were people traveling through the area constantly, and they could accommodate up to 5,000 people. Next, please. There's very little in the way of historic record. There was no written language. There are no Rosetta Stones. The people of Chaco disappeared. They occupied the canyon around 1080 to about 1200 AD, and then disappeared without leaving an explanation. And there are no Pueblo people in the region now who trace their ancestry to the Chacoans. That doesn't mean that there aren't people descended from the Chacoans, but they don't know what the connection is. So the only real historic evidence, the only hard record of what happened in Chaco are these buildings. And a lot can be learned from them. One of the first things that can be learned from them is that these people were really good at building and at masonry. And they worked really hard because much of this rock was brought from great distances. An interesting thing I learned about it, I found it interesting, is that many of these buildings were periodically destroyed and rebuilt, or destroyed and rebuilt in a different way, or features of the buildings were changed. And apparently this had something to do with their cultural tradition of a cyclic history and rebirth and regeneration. And they mimicked this or illustrated this in their buildings. And then another key thing about these buildings, which has been discovered over the years, is that there are many celestial alignments. Next slide, please. The alignments appear in lots of places. Inside the buildings, many of the doorways are aligned. And I took this picture inside one of the houses in Bonito, Pueblo. And the doors are aligned, but they're aligned on a curve. So there was no way to position myself so that I could get a picture straight down the row of doorways, because they aren't in a straight line. They follow the curve of the outside of the building. So that was kind of cool. And the masonry inside is just as perfect as the masonry outside. These buildings have not been reconstructed. They've held up all this time. Also inside the buildings, it's been found that some of the windows are aligned with the positions of celestial objects at certain times of year. So there are windows that admit the sunlight or moonlight or starlight at certain times of year when the moon or the sun or a star is just in the right place in the sky. And there are alignments of the exterior walls. Some of the walls are aligned with the rising point of the sun on at the summer solstice. Some of the walls are aligned with the points of the compass, which are not, by the way, north, south, east, or west. The Chacoan compass appears to have been an X. So the canonical directions were northeast, northwest, and so on, with Chaco at the center. And some of the walls, the curved walls, if the curve is followed from the wall out across the mesas and the surrounding countryside, those curves lead to other buildings that are many miles away and can't be seen from Chaco. But if you follow the curve of the walls, you'll eventually get to these distant trading partners or ceremonial sites or whatever. So the alignments were built in and they're still there, and they show us what was important, or at least what we think was important to the people who built these buildings. Next, please. So in the next slide, you can see the interior of one of the great kivas. These were ceremonial buildings. This one is at a site called Kettle, and this picture shows some of the interior structures in the kiva, and apparently we have no idea what those were. They could have contained water. They could have contained grain. They could have contained fuel. Don't know. Nobody's talking. We don't have anything to go on except, oh, look, there are some interesting structures. They must have been important. Somebody took the care to build them very well, and they have held up all these years. All of these buildings, by the way, the square rooms, like the ones you can see in the background, and the circular kivas, all had roofs. Many of them had multiple floors. When Chaco was originally built, many of the structures had 3 or 4 levels. And you can see in some of the structures, I think it might show in the next picture. Stare at this up close. Yes. In the background is a very high wall, and right across the middle of it, you can see, if you have very good eyesight, you can see the pieces of timber embedded in the wall, which supported the second floor. I took this picture because it was just interesting to see. Chaco is not safe and has never been safe. It's built right up against the face of a cliff, and the cliff is eroding. And for many years, there was a big rock formation just to the north of this particular building that was called the Troublesome Rock by the people who were occupying Chaco at the time. This was in the 20th century. And the Troublesome Rock looked like it was a threat to this building. And so the Native Americans in the area had built stone walls as buttresses to hold this rock in place. But in the late 1930s and early 1940s, I don't remember the exact dates, the Civilian Conservation Corps was doing a lot of work at national parks. And they came to Chaco and they saw these stone walls that were pressing up against the Troublesome Rock, and decided that those were recent additions and did not belong, and they knocked them down. And not long after that, Troublesome Rock fell onto this structure. And those big boulders in the foreground are the pieces of Troublesome Rock and the pieces of the building that were knocked down at that time. So I hope somebody learned a lesson from this. Next slide, please. This is just another building at Chaco Canyon, Kinklezzo. This dates from, as you can see, 1125 to 1130. It has a large kiva, a great kiva, and also some smaller kivas that are just visible. But one reason I included this was to show that in the arroyo, which is visible in the background, there is still water flowing. The Chaco is not quite dry. And in fact, even at the campground, we had plenty of water, and that water came from an artesian well in the canyon. So they are not shipping water in. At least I just saw no evidence that they were shipping water in. They're getting their water from local sources. And there are critters living there. In the mornings when we headed into the canyon to take our photographs, we frequently spotted elk, and there were antelope and smaller critters running around in the arroyo, taking advantage of the water and the shade. So it's pretty inhospitable now, but in the past it must have been a nicer place to live, an easier place to live. Next picture, please. In addition to building all these structures, the Chacoans also built a network of roads, and they wanted people to know where these roads are. Now, in the picture in the middle or on the left, um, there is a road. You'll have to take my word for it because it's completely invisible. It has eroded and been covered by scrub, and you can't see it. But it shows up in LiDAR. There are scientists now who have been mapping all the ancient roads in Chaco using LiDAR, a radar technique that can see through vegetation and light soil. And the Chacoans actually wanted people to find this road. And so on the cliff um, above the canyon floor, they carved a series of holes. And I've highlighted 3 of them, but they're actually a row of about 6 or 7 of these holes. They're about 6 to 8 inches in diameter, and they're just dug into the limestone rock, and they're in a straight line, and they point to the road. The road is there, but I can't show it to you. But I was curious, and I took this picture because I was wondering, well, why is there a road there? It's pointing right at the cliff directly across the arroyo. And so I took a picture up close of that cliff. And what's there and what the road is pointing directly at is a stone pillar that's a naturally occurring rock formation. Why a road was built and so much effort was made to point at this cliff and this pillar, I have no idea. And I haven't heard an explanation. And I don't know if that pillar looked like that 1,000 years ago. Probably not. But anyway, these roads exist. Some of them were used for transportation. Some of them had ceremonial purposes. Some of them appear to have been aligned with celestial events. And all we can do is speculate about what their purpose was. But there are hundreds. There are lots of roads. Next, please. There are also petroglyphs. And I did not have time to get to the most famous petroglyph in Chaco. It's a 14-mile hike, and it was close to 95 degrees most days, and I wasn't doing it. I'll go back sometime when it's cooler. But I did get to these petroglyphs, and they're all over the canyon walls, and there's no explanation of what they mean. Some of them obviously are animals. The spirals may have some celestial significance. They are a little hard to see. These had pretty good contrast with the background rock, but in the next picture is a different set of petroglyphs that are almost invisible now. And what's happening is when the petroglyphs were first pecked into the wall, the limestone is much lighter than the surface of the cliffs because the surface is darkened by exposure to the sun and wind and weather, and gradually develops a darkened surface called desert varnish. When the petroglyphs were first made, they contrasted sharply with the surrounding cliff. But now 1,000 years has gone by, and the desert varnish is still being deposited, and it's gradually darkening the petroglyphs, and they will eventually disappear. But they're still there, and they're still very interesting, and they're all over the place. The most famous petroglyph, the one I didn't go see, shows a supernova. And it's kind of unambiguous. It looks like a celestial object. It's very bright. It's surrounded by other representations of stars and so on that indicate where it was in the sky. And it appears to date from 1056, I believe is the date, which is the time of the supernova, which was seen all over the planet and was recorded by other cultures and other places in the world. And the remains of that supernova are now visible and called the Crab Nebula. So that supernova was seen by people in Chaco. They noticed it and they recorded it. Next, please. So this was a picture from our campsite the first night. A lovely place to camp. It's very nice in the evening when the sun was going down, and the Airstream trailers in the background were the camp supervisors, the camp hosts, year-round dwellings, and then in the campsite itself, there were places for RVs. We were all in tents, um, and we could walk to the cliffs and up the cliffs from our campsite, and there were cliff dwellings, and there were pueblos and ruins all around, and you're really right in the thick of things when you're in the Chaco Park. Next, please. And I was just grooving on this beautiful sunset. I just took a lot of pictures. Unfortunately, I couldn't take any pictures at night because I haven't figured out how to use my camera to take nighttime pictures. So next, please. As the sun went down, it cast beautiful shadows, and then it got dark. And it was beautiful. And my job was to do a little star talk that night. And so I sat out with the other campers, and we watched the constellations and the planets come out. We cursed the moon that was making the sky too bright to see very much, but it was still a beautiful night. The next morning, I got up before dawn and got out of my tent and walked around, and the sky was stunning. And I say this as someone who has spent many years under dark skies. Much of my career was spent in Flagstaff, Arizona, which is an international dark sky site. And we could see the Milky Way in Flagstaff from any place at all, from our front porch. So I'm used to dark skies, but I had never seen a sky like the one over Chaco. This is a very remote area. There are no big cities brightening the sky at all. The air is thin and dry, and the sky just gets inky black, and the stars were blazing, and the Milky Way was bright enough to cast shadows. I could see the Andromeda galaxy, our neighboring large galaxy. I could see it with my naked eye in that dark sky, and I have never seen it before, and I've been looking. And what I realized when I saw that sky is that there was every reason to think that the night sky was important to the people who lived in Chaco. The daytime sky was fine. It was blue. It was pretty. The night sky was amazing. It still is amazing, and people would have noticed. And I could understand at that point why it was important to them to mark the passage of the stars and the moon and the sun, and to feel that they understood and were in sync with the celestial sphere. I don't see how you could live there and escape the significance of the night sky. Next, please. Now, this is the most famous petroglyph, and this is the object that got me hooked by Chaco so many years ago. The Anna Sofar was exploring Chaco, and she discovered this spiral cut into the stone on the side of Fajada Butte. And she happened to be there in the early summer. She hung around, and she noticed that on at the time of the summer solstice, the light of the sun came through these three slabs of rock that were leaning against the cliff. The Sundagger, the spiral, is cut into the cliff behind these rocks. At the summer solstice, the light of the summer sun comes through the spaces between the rocks, and it forms a needle or a dagger of light that crosses right through the center of this spiral. So that got her attention. And later, she was there for other celestial significant events: the winter solstice, the equinox, and some lunar events, lunar alignments. And she recorded the pattern of light and shadow on this spiral at those different times. And that's how she became convinced that this was an astronomical, if not a tool, if not something for predicting these events, it was at least something to record them. and to mark their passing. So a few years after Anna discovered this object, so many people came to Fajada Butte and came to see the Sundagger and came to look at the slabs of stone and touched things and leaned on them and trampled around on them, that the stones were moved. And the Sundagger, as I've been told, no longer aligns perfectly with the spiral. And the Park Service realized that damage was being done, and they have closed the trails to the Sundagger. So no one goes up there unless they're actually genuine researchers and have applied for permission and understand the risks and are, promised to be careful. So I didn't get to see it, but that's okay. I know it's there, and I'm glad they're protecting it. It needs to be protected. Next, please. Besides the solstices and the equinoxes, which are solar events, the Sundagger also appears to show alignments with lunar events, and in particular with two events called the major and minor lunar standstills. And I'm a professional astronomer. I've been an astronomer for nearly 40 years, and I had never heard of these things. And when I told my husband, who is also an astronomer, he said, "What the heck is that? You're making that up. I've never heard of that." So this is sort of esoteric stuff for most of us. But it does appear that there is some alignment that marks these events. So these diagrams are from earthsky.org, and I found them online. And they show that there are three angles that make a difference in where the sun and the moon appear in the sky. One of these angles, well, actually, there are two angles that make a difference. One of these angles is the tilt of the Earth's axis with respect to the plane of the orbit of the Earth around the sun. So the Earth orbits in a plane, all the planets do, and that plane is called the ecliptic. And the Earth is tilted with respect to the ecliptic by 23.5 degrees. And because of that, as the Earth orbits the sun appears to be higher or lower in our sky at different times of the year. When the axis of the Earth is pointed towards the sun, then the sun appears to be higher in our sky. And that happens in the northern hemisphere in the summer. When the axis of the Earth is pointed away from the sun, then the reverse is true. The sun appears to be lower in the sky. And we see that in our winter months. The moon orbits the Earth, and the plane of the moon's orbit is tilted with respect to the Earth's tilt by another 5 degrees. So, and the plane of the Earth's orbit and the plane of the moon's orbit rotate slowly around in space, maintaining the 5-degree angle between them, but rotating around. And they complete one full rotation every 18.6 years. I'm not going to go into all the numbers, but it affects where the moon, the elevation of the moon above the horizon at different times of year, and that elevation change and the place where the moon rises on our horizon and sets on our horizon changes over time, periodically, and the period of that change is 18.6 years. Okay, and when the moon reaches its maximum angle of elevation change, or the maximum of the difference between its rising point and its setting point on our horizon, that is called the major lunar standstill. And a very interesting thing happens, and you can see it in the next picture. Well, not the next picture, but let me explain. The next picture, please. About 100 miles north of Chaco Canyon is this structure, this naturally occurring structure called Chimney Rock. And this is Chimney Rock and Companion Rock. and they are in Chimney Rock State Park in southern Colorado. And the photographer taking this picture is standing on a mesa to the south of Chimney Rock. Every 18.6 years, when the moon reaches its major lunar standstill, when it's as high as it's going to appear in the sky, and the angle between its rising point and its setting point on the horizon is at a maximum, at that time, the full moon rises between those two spires. Next picture, please. And this is the last time that happened, and it's pretty spectacular. So this could not be seen from Chaco. There is no geological formation, there is no building, there is no road, there is no alignment that indicates where this is going to happen. But at Chimney Rock, there is. These spires of rock frame the rising moon at this one time of the year, and it actually frames it for about 2 or 3 days because the moon is not changing its elevation when it gets to that maximum point. It's about to change direction. And so currently, people trying to understand Chaco culture speculate that the people of Chimney Rock, who were trading partners of the folks in Chaco, saw this event, told their friends in Chaco Canyon, you got to see this. This is terrific. And the guys in Chaco went, that is really significant. That's obviously a significant celestial event. We're going to record it. And they made sure that their spiral at Fajada Butte was drawn in such a way that it would mark the moment when the moon reached major lunar standstill. There's also a minor lunar standstill when the moon is at its lowest elevation and the smallest angular change between its rising and setting point on the horizon, and that is marked in the Sundagger as well. So this is a case of something having been possibly discovered in one location and then commemorated and recorded and marked in Chaco, which was the center of the culture. It's all just speculation. Of course, we don't know for sure, but it appears to be some information that was shared between these two locations. Oh, and by the way, you can still go see this phenomenon. And I believe the next apparition, the next major lunar standstill is coming up in 2025. And the Chimney Rock State Park will sell passes. Just a few. They don't allow crowds. But if you keep an eye on the website for Chimney Rock State Park, you can catch the announcement, get a pass, and they will allow a small number of well-behaved people to go there and see this. They don't want druids. They don't want people painted blue. They don't want big festivities. They don't want fireworks. But they will allow a few people at a time to go see this phenomenon. So I'm going to be watching for the opportunity. Next, please. So I keep saying we don't know and we are speculating, and that is the case. We don't have a written history. We don't have people who will tell us what's happening. If you hear somebody say, I know what happened in Chaco, I know the meaning of all of this, they don't. They may wish they do, they may be convinced that they do, but they don't. And one person, I'd heard this before, but this gentleman, John Cajate, from the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center in Albuquerque, came to speak to us at Chaco during our camping trip. And he told us a lot about alignments and the skills of the builders and the importance culturally of these sites, but he didn't go into a lot of detail. But one thing he repeated several times, so it really sank in, was that the sacred stories and the traditions and the ceremonial practices of the Pueblo peoples in the past and today cannot be shared with outsiders. And everyone knows this. Children are raised to know and understand this. They cannot share this information with outsiders without harm to themselves, to their people, and to the entire world. So we are not going to get the answers to these questions. We can speculate, we can think about it, we can recognize that there are connections, but we're not going to get much deeper than that. And you just need to accept that. They're going to be mysteries. Next, please. So what is the value of visiting Chaco? Well, it's not for everybody, let me tell you. It was hot and dry and windy and some of the toughest camping I've ever done. So if you're not up for that, don't go. It's hard to get there. The road is very bumpy. It's 22 miles of washboarded dirt road. If it rains, there are arroyos that become filled with water and wash out the road, and you can't get in or you can't get out. It's very isolated. There's no Wi-Fi. Electricity is kind of iffy. So you have to rough it to spend time in Chaco. For me, it was 100% worthwhile, and I can't wait to get back. It's a beautiful place and a powerful experience being there. It was actually a relief, as some of you may imagine. It was a relief to get away from technology for a while, actually. Couldn't answer my email, couldn't read my email. That was fine. It's great. And it is just awesomely impressive. And seeing what people accomplished 1,000 years ago without the wheel, without technology, without beasts of burden, they built an amazing place and with great skill. And it's just awe-inspiring. So for me, it was worth it. And I think many of you might also find it very rewarding. And finally, the last question is in this next slide, the last question is Chaco threatened? And this, yes, this GIF is running. This is a diagram showing all the oil and natural gas wells that have been built and are being built around Chaco. The little irregular figure in black in the middle is Chaco Canyon. The red dots are the wells and mines within 5 miles of Chaco. The yellow dots are within 10 miles. The green are within 15. The brown are outside of that. And what this diagram doesn't show is if you had an even larger area of view, you would see that there are just thousands and thousands and thousands of wells to the northeast up in Colorado, and more being built all the time. And basically Chaco is in an area that is rich with oil and natural gas, and there are plenty of people who want to get at it. And it needs protection. And so far so good, but it is threatened. And so we can hope that word gets out that this is worth saving and worth visiting. So that's what I had to share with you today. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer. And thank you for listening.
Okay, Alice, it'll take a few seconds because there's some latency in the people who are watching live are a little bit behind us, so it's going to take a few seconds. If people have any questions, they may be entering it into the chat. Oh, I see a question right now. You mentioned the damage to the Sundagger alignment. What are the trade-offs between preserving sites like these and sharing their natural and cultural riches?
Well, those are not the only two options. I mentioned that there's someone doing LiDAR ranging in Chaco. And what he's doing and has done, not just in Chaco, but all over the Southwest, is he's using LiDAR to create three-dimensional models, digital models of these sites, both the buildings and the natural features, so that we can explore and appreciate and enjoy these natural and cultural riches without actually going in person. And he gave a lecture to our group, and he showed us his models, and it's phenomenal. I mean, he's recorded the Sundagger and the mountains, the cliff and the slabs and everything, so that they can be explored in great detail without actually climbing up there and getting our grubby hands on it. So yeah, the more people go there, the more damage will be done. And so I think they have to control access to preserve the sites. Um, and I think the Park Service is trying to find the sweet spot between keeping people out entirely and letting a few people go in who are going to be careful and are not going to trash things any further, we hope. But yeah, it is a trade-off.
So we also have a question saying you didn't mention the Anasazi. Is Chaco part of that culture, or is that a separate culture?
Um, well, actually, somebody asked John Gahate that, and he said, first of all, Anasazi is not an Indian word. That was not a term that the people called themselves, and they are not a coherent group. It's just a word that the Spanish gave to people who aren't there anymore and apparently were able to live in arid regions. And whether the Chacoans were part of the Anasazi culture or not, apparently is not known, or at least no one is saying. But what John did say is that DNA research has indicated that the modern day Hopi appear to have, what's it called? A haploid group in their DNA that, in their mitochondria, that indicate a possible connection with the people of Chaco. Now, this to me implies that somehow they've gotten DNA from the people of Chaco, and I don't know how they did that. But there were a lot of relics left behind, and there were a lot of burials left behind. So I suppose it's plausible that DNA has been extracted from some of those burials. But the actual connection is not well known.
Do we know how long it took to carve a petroglyph like the Sundagger spiral? And are there estimates of how many 18-year cycles would have had to pass during the process to carve it accurately?
I have not heard an estimate of how long it took to carve that spiral. I mean, obviously, it could be done in a day. But my guess would be, and this is my guess, is that parts of it would have been carved. Marks would have been made in the stone. Other people may have better ideas than I do, but if I were doing it, I would wait until the folks at Chimney Rock said, "This is it. The moon's in the right position," and then I would go and look at the patterns of light and dark on that cliff wall and make a mark where the light from the moon appeared on the wall, and then go back later in another apparition and make a mark, and just gradually over a period of many years map out where the light and shadow fell on that face. But we don't have an explanation or a record, so we can only speculate about how it was done.
Okay, not seeing any other questions at the moment. We'll give people just a moment to enter into the chat if you have any other questions. Otherwise, do you have any parting thoughts, Alice?
Well, just on a personal note, this is a silly thing, but in all my years of camping, I have never before been on a camping trip where I didn't get rained on. And I've been in lots of different places, and I always got rained on or snowed on. And so I was wondering what would happen in Chaco. And this was my very first experience camping where there was not a drop of rain until the day after I left, when it rained in Chaco, and it rained for about a week. And I was fascinated by this because it's so dry. It hardly ever rains there, but they got significant rain, and then their meteorological station went offline, and I got no more information about that. But this year, Chaco got water, so must have been amazing.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you, Alice, for sharing your experience with us and talking with us about our guesses at what the Chacoan people were doing. The Sundagger looks amazing. It's a shame that it's been damaged, but at least we have the recording of how it worked
Yep,
when it was at its peak. And I hope that folks will come to future talks and continue to support the Friends of Arlington's David M. Brown Planetarium.
absolutely.
So until next time, we want to thank you for coming and
My pleasure.
look for information about upcoming talks.